The morning air hung thick with dust and the promise of heat when Thomas Hartwell found the body. It lay twisted among the sage brush, arms spread wide like a broken scarecrow, the blue cavalry uniform torn and faded. Vultures circled overhead, their shadows dancing across the cracked earth as Thomas dismounted his horse, boots crunching on the brittle ground. He had been tracking strays for 3 days, following hoofprints that led deeper into Apache territory than any sensible man would venture. The soldier had been dead for weeks, maybe months, his face weathered to leather by sun and wind. But it wasn't the corpse that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. It was what lay beside it, half buried in sand and tumbleweeds, gleaming like captured sunlight even in the harsh desert morning. A headdress, magnificent and sacred, its eagle feathers pristine despite the elements, each one bound with sinew and painted with symbols that seemed to pulse with ancient power. Thomas knelt beside it, his weathered hands trembling as he lifted the ceremonial crown. The weight of it surprised him, not just the physical heft, but something deeper, something that spoke of generations and spirits and blood spilled on sacred ground. This wasn't just ceremonial dress. This was the crown of a chief, a war leader, someone whose absence would be felt like a wound in the heart of his people. He looked back at the soldier's remains, at the broken rifle beside him, at the scattered brass buttons that told their own story of violence and theft. The man had died alone in the desert with another man's sacred burden, and now that burden had passed to Thomas. He could leave it where he found it, could turn his back and ride away. But something in those painted feathers called to him, something that reminded him of honor, of debts that transcended the color of a man's skin. The ride back to his ranch took 2 days, and with each mile, Thomas felt the weight of his decision settling into his bones. His ranch squatted in a valley between 2 ridges, a modest spread that had been his home for 8 years. The house was simple, built from local stone and timber, with a wide porch that faced the mountains. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, honest living. That night, Thomas sat on his porch with the headdress resting on the table beside him, its feathers stirring in the evening breeze. He poured himself a whiskey and watched the sun die behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. The silence was complete, broken only by the distant call of a coyote and the creak of settling timber. The decision came to him like dawn, gradual and then sudden. He would return the headdress to the Apache, would ride into their territory and face whatever judgment waited there. It wasn't about courage or foolishness. It was about the simple recognition that some things belonged to the people who made them sacred, and no amount of war or conquest could change that truth. 3 days later, Thomas rode north toward the Apache stronghold, the headdress wrapped carefully in oilcloth and tied to his saddle. He carried no weapons save his hunting knife, no supplies beyond water and hardtack for 3 days. This wasn't a trading mission or a military expedition. This was something older, something that required him to come empty-handed and trust in the ancient laws of hospitality and honor. The land grew wilder as he climbed into the high country, the desert giving way to pine and granite peaks that scraped the belly of the sky. On the 2nd day, he found the first sign that he was being watched. A stone had been moved, placed deliberately in the center of the trail where no natural force would have put it. An hour later, he saw a flash of movement among the trees. They were tracking him, had been since he crossed into their territory. He made camp that night beside a small stream, building a fire and preparing his meager meal while the forest watched. He could feel eyes on him, could sense the presence of warriors in the darkness beyond the firelight. But no arrows came, no war cries shattered the mountain silence. They were waiting, judging, deciding whether he was friend or enemy. When he woke the next morning, the headdress was gone. Thomas sat up slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs as he searched the campsite. The oilcloth lay empty beside his bedroll, and his horse stood untouched, still saddled and ready for the trail. They had taken what they came for and left him alive, a message as clear as spoken words. The debt was acknowledged. The sacred burden returned to its people. The sun was setting when he reached his ranch, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose. Thomas unsaddled his horse and walked to the porch, his bones aching from 2 days in the saddle. He poured himself a whiskey and settled into his chair, grateful for the familiar comfort of home. That's when he saw her. She stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the porch light, her figure silhouetted against the dying sky. A woman, young and proud, with long black hair that caught the last rays of sunlight. She wore traditional Apache dress, soft deerskin decorated with beadwork that seemed to glow in the twilight. In her hands, she held gifts that spoke of acceptance and respect. She walked forward slowly, her feet making no sound on the packed earth. When she reached the porch, she set the gifts on the steps and looked up at him, with eyes that held depths he couldn't fathom. "You returned what was stolen," she said finally, her English careful but clear. "My grandfather's war crown, taken when he died defending our people. The soldiers thought it was just feathers and beads, but you knew better." Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. The woman stepped closer, and he could see the intelligence in her dark eyes, the strength in her bearing that spoke of survival in a world that had shown her little mercy. "I am Ayanna," she continued, and the name fell from her lips like music. "Granddaughter of Chief Running Bear, keeper of his memory and his honor. You have given us back more than eagle feathers and paint. You have given us back our pride." She gestured to the gifts at his feet. "These are not payment, they are recognition. You are welcome in our territory, welcome at our fires, welcome as a friend who understands that some things are worth more than gold or land." Thomas stood slowly, setting his whiskey aside. "I'm just a rancher, miss. I saw something that didn't belong to me and tried to do right by it." Ayanna smiled, and the expression transformed her face from merely beautiful to radiant. "Simple is what you call it, when you know the difference between right and wrong, and choose right, even when it's dangerous." The days that followed brought unexpected visitors. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb led a patrol of cavalry soldiers, searching for stolen military property and Apache fugitives. Thomas told them nothing, claimed to have seen no one but jackrabbits and stubborn cattle, but Webb's suspicions were aroused, and he left with threats and promises to return. Ayanna came back 3 days later, bringing food and stories of her people. Their conversations grew longer and more intimate as the days passed. She told him about her childhood in the Apache camps, about the stories her grandfather had shared, and the traditions that had been passed down through generations. He spoke of his own past, of the farm in Virginia where he had been raised, of the war that had taken his brothers and left him hollow inside. "You saved me because you couldn't save her," Ayanna said one evening, somehow understanding the guilt that had driven him west. Thomas had told her about his sister, about how raiders had killed her while he was away, about the shame that had eaten at him ever since. He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. She reached for his hand, pressed her cheek into his palm, and then, as if by instinct, they leaned into each other. The kiss was quiet, hesitant at first, then fuller, as if both had been holding their breath for too long, and finally remembered how to exhale. But their peace was fragile. Webb returned with more soldiers and search warrants, convinced that Thomas was harboring Apache fugitives. The search found nothing, but the threat was clear. Thomas was being watched, marked as a suspected traitor to his own people. The night after the soldiers left, Ayanna came to him with tears in her eyes. "Webb has put a price on my head," she said quietly. $500, dead or alive. He wants to make an example of me, to show other Apache what happens when they resist." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. The sum was staggering, more money than most men on the frontier would see in a lifetime. "You can't go back to the mountains. Webb's patrols are everywhere." "What are you saying?" Thomas felt the weight of the moment, the knowledge that his next words would change everything. "I'm saying you can stay here. There's an old root cellar behind the barn, built into the hillside. It's hidden, cool and dry. She searched his face, looking for any sign of deception. You would risk your life for a woman you barely know? I'd do it for someone whose people I've wronged, even if not directly, Thomas replied, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. There was something about her that called to him in ways he didn't fully understand. For weeks they lived in secret harmony. Thomas went about his ranch work during the day, but in the evenings he would bring food and water to Ayanna in the hidden cellar. Their friendship deepened with each passing day, built on shared stories and quiet moments of understanding. She told him about her family's massacre, about the false accusations that had made her a fugitive. He spoke of his loneliness, of the peace he was finding in her presence. But sanctuary was not destined to last. On a hot afternoon in late summer, Thomas saw the dust cloud approaching from the east, a large patrol, at least 20 riders, moving with the purposeful pace of men on a mission. Webb led them, his face grim with determination, as the soldiers spread out in a loose formation around the ranch. "We have reason to believe you're harboring a fugitive," Webb announced. "An Apache woman known as Ayanna, wanted for raids on white settlements and the murder of soldiers." The soldiers searched with methodical precision, and it was a young private who found the hidden door behind the barn. Ayanna emerged slowly, her hands raised in surrender, her eyes holding no accusation or regret as she looked at Thomas. "You lied to me, Hartwell," Webb said, his voice deadly quiet. "You've been harboring a known terrorist." Webb raised his pistol, aiming it at Ayanna's head. "I should shoot you both right here." But before he could pull the trigger, another voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Colonel." Everyone turned to see a figure emerging from the tree line. An Apache warrior, tall and proud, with the bearing of a man born to command. Chief Joseph Two Bears, Ayanna's grandfather, carrying an old Henry rifle. "Your granddaughter is a wanted criminal," Webb snarled. Joseph Two Bears smiled without warmth. "Look around you, Colonel. Look at the ridges, at the trees, at the shadows." Webb's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the surrounding terrain. They were everywhere, Apache warriors positioned on the ridges, in the trees, behind rocks. At least 50 men, all armed, all watching with the patience of predators. "You're surrounded, Colonel," Joseph Two Bears said calmly. "Your patrol is outnumbered 3-1. This white man returned my father's war crown to our people, showed honor when he could have chosen profit. He has earned our protection." Webb stood frozen, his pistol still aimed but his hand shaking with indecision. Finally, he holstered the weapon and stepped back. "This isn't over. I'll return with more men." "Perhaps," Joseph Two Bears nodded. "But for today, it is enough." The patrol rode away in humiliation, leaving behind only threats and the knowledge that the game had changed. Joseph Two Bears looked at Thomas with eyes that seemed to see into his soul. "You cannot stay here any longer," he said to his granddaughter. "Webb will return with an army, but you," he turned to Thomas, "have earned the right to choose your path." He gestured to the ridges where the Apache warriors were emerging from hiding. "You can remain here under our protection, or you can come with us, join our people in the mountains, become one of us in spirit, if not in blood." Thomas looked at Ayanna, seeing the hope in her eyes, the love she had tried so hard to conceal. He thought of his lonely ranch, of the years of solitude that stretched before him, of the empty conversations with cattle and wind. "I'll need time to arrange things here," he said finally, "to sell my cattle, to close up the ranch." Ayanna's face lit up with joy, and she stepped closer to him. "You're sure? You're willing to leave everything behind?" Thomas reached out and took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin against his palm. "I'm not leaving everything behind. I'm taking the most important thing with me." 3 days later, as the sun rose over the mountains, the Apache warriors returned. Thomas was ready, his few belongings packed, his cattle sold, his old life abandoned for something infinitely more precious. The ceremony was simple but profound. Joseph Two Bears spoke in Apache, his words carrying the weight of ancient tradition. Thomas knelt in the dust of his ranch yard, feeling the hands of the elders on his shoulders as they welcomed him into their tribe. "From this day forward," Joseph Two Bears said, "you are Straight Arrow, Apache warrior and protector. You have earned this name through your actions, through your choice to return what was stolen." Ayanna placed a necklace around his neck, turquoise and silver, that marked him as one of her people. "And from this day forward, you are my husband, my heart made flesh." As the small party began their journey into the mountains, Thomas rode beside Ayanna, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Behind them, his ranch grew smaller until it was lost in the vastness of the desert, becoming just another memory in a life transformed by the simple act of returning what had been stolen. The Apache stronghold was hidden deep in the mountains, a place of natural beauty and ancient power where eagle-topped cliffs rose toward the sky and clear streams sang through narrow valleys. Thomas was welcomed with ceremonies that lasted 3 days, during which he learned the basics of Apache culture and tradition. Ayanna was his guide through this new world, patient and loving as she helped him navigate the complexities of tribal life. Their love grew stronger with each passing day, deepened by shared experiences and the knowledge that they had chosen each other despite the obstacles. They were married again in the full Apache tradition, and when it was over, they were given a small dwelling at the edge of the village. Spring came early to the mountains that year, bringing with it the news that Ayanna was carrying their first child. The child was born in late summer, a daughter with her mother's dark eyes and her father's determined chin. They named her Paloma in Spanish, but her Apache name was White Wing, signifying her role as a messenger between worlds. She was perfect in every way, a living symbol of the love that had grown between them, despite all the forces that had tried to keep them apart. Years passed peacefully in the mountain stronghold, with Thomas becoming one of the tribe's most trusted scouts. But peace was always fragile on the frontier, and eventually the outside world found its way to their sanctuary. The attack came on a crisp autumn morning when Paloma was 3 years old. Colonel Webb led the assault, his face twisted with savage satisfaction as he finally claimed his revenge. The Apache warriors fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. In the midst of the battle, Thomas found Ayanna, her rifle smoking from recent use. "We have to get Paloma to safety," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos. They fought their way toward the evacuation route, but as they reached the edge of the village, Webb's bullet tore through Thomas's shoulder. "At last," Webb sneered, approaching with his smoking pistol. "The traitor and the terrorist, together at the end." But before he could finish them, the haunting call of an eagle echoed through the valley. Apache warriors appeared on the canyon walls, their bows singing as they sent death down upon the soldiers. It was an ambush within an ambush, led by Joseph Two Bears and his war party. Webb died fighting, his pistol empty, his uniform torn and bloody. When the shooting stopped, the village was saved but scarred. The attack marked the beginning of the end for the Apache way of life in those mountains, but they would survive, as they always had. Thomas and Ayanna recovered from their wounds, and their love endured, stronger for having been tested in the fires of war and hatred. Paloma grew up knowing the stories of both her peoples, carrying within her the hope that someday the wounds between races might heal. Years later, when Paloma was grown and had children of her own, she would tell them the story of how their grandfather had found a sacred headdress in the desert and chosen honor over safety, love over fear. In the telling, the story would become legend, passed down through generations as a reminder that love could triumph over hatred, that understanding was possible between peoples who seemed destined to be enemies. The wind still whispers through the canyons where the Apache once lived, carrying with it the memory of those who chose love over hate, honor over profit, family over fear. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, You can hear the echo of an eagle's cry, calling across the years with a message of hope for all who have the courage to hear it.